Hello there, my name is Sharon Elliott Fox, and I'm a retired United Methodist pastor currently attending Wall Street United Methodist Church. Welcome to By the Well podcast, where you will hear sermons, conversations, and opportunities to engage online with Wall Street. I look forward to seeing you in the comments, and remember to like and share wherever you listen. Thank you for being a part of our community.
Today's Gospel reading is Mark 12:38 through 44. Would you please stand as you are willing, or as you are able? As he taught, he said, Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have the best scats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour windows, houses, and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They receive the greater condemnation. He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowded putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then she called his disciples, and he said to them, Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all them have contributed one out of their abundance, but she put out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. The word of God to the people of God. Thanks be to God.
This may come as a surprise to a lot of you, but I was a theater and speech major in college. Does that come as a surprise? No, not really. Little did I know that God was preparing me for the ministry way back then. I thought I was going to be a director. So because I was interested in directing, I had the opportunity to stage a full-on play in the main theater of our college. And I chose a Japanese play called Rashomon. Has anybody ever seen that old movie from the 50s? Steve had to watch it, of course. It's worth it. It's it's done by a well-known Japanese director. It's based on a Japanese short story, as was the play. It is set in a forest in Japan. It's a very strange tale that's full of tangled points of view. There's a samurai warrior speaking from the grave through a medium, his wife, a bandit, the bad guy, and a woodcutter. And they all offer their point of view of the violent actions that took place in the woods. And that's one of the main themes of the play, is how different people look at the same situation and offer diverse points of view, or, as our slide says, POV. That's the abbreviation for point of view. I thought of that play as I approached the story of the widow's small offering. Sometimes it's called the widow's mite, because a mite is very small, so her offering was about as small as you can make an offering in that kind of money, that we heard Gary read today from the Gospel of Mark. I'd like us to step into that scene and consider those various points of view that are suggested in it. There's the widowed woman who is poor, making that tiny offering. There are the teachers of the law, called the scribes, the disciples of Jesus, and perhaps there was a crowd even beyond the 12 disciples gathered around, because this was a public setting. And in fact, if you look at where this sits in the gospel story, it is Jesus' last teaching in a public space before Holy Week starts. So it's really his last public teaching. And of course, Jesus himself, the rabbi, the teacher, who notices this poor woman and offers it as a teachable moment for his followers. And as to the setting, again, in my theater background, how would you set this? It was in the large temple in Jerusalem. And when we say large, it was quite large, very large. And this was taking place in what's known as the Court of the Women. You know that because there's a woman there. since women were not allowed further into the inner courts of the temple, where the men would go on beyond, I think it's very thoughtful that the temple officials placed the offering boxes in the court of the women so that they too can donate. There were 13 donation boxes, I'm told, and that was the whole temple treasury that was there in the women's court. One of the great saints of the church, Ignatius of Loyola, taught a way to pray that invites us to use our imaginations so that we can enter into a gospel story to get the sense of what's really going on. He thinks of it as a way of praying, stepping into the story, and looking at those various points of view. So I invite you to try that as we move through looking at this story. And over 2,000 years of Christianity, artists have also used their imaginations to envision the Bible scene as well, various ones. If you look at the front of your bulletin, we have a contemporary image of the woman, and she's all by herself, coming up the big steps leading to the temple. I think it was a photo, as best I could tell from online, that someone set up. And then on this sermon slide, we have an old Bible illustration by Doré. He did a whole bunch of illustrations of the Bible. And you can see that Jesus, who's got the halo on, you can tell who it is because he's got the halo. Jesus is there pointing out. He's got his hand out. He's pointing what's going on down the steps. There's the woman putting the money in. And then also in front of him are probably the scribes that are mentioned earlier in this message that Jesus points out. I got fascinated as I started looking for some images. That's one of the things we have to do when we get ready for a sermon is we think about like what's going to go on the front of the bulletin. And I was going through the internet and I got fascinated by all the different points of view. So I wanted to try a couple more pictures to share with you. Now, Steve, this is where there we go. Okay, so the first one is that woman and child. I confess that until I started this little exercise, I had always thought the woman was an older woman in my mind. The widow was older. But here in this French painting from the late 1800s, we see a younger woman and her child. And indeed, many of the pictures I found showed a woman with children gathered around her as she was putting money in the box. That certainly enlarged my thinking about this story. And interestingly, you'll notice that the artist here pictures the woman and her child in the clothing of his time, not in biblical attire. So he, I think, was trying to say to his audience, stretch your minds a little bit more. It wasn't just back then, it's now too. The second one is a Greek, actually a modern Greek Orthodox icon. Icons are used for prayer. And there's Jesus and 4 disciples. I imagine they're supposed to be the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they are very, I think I would say, up close and very personal, standing right up next to the woman as she drops the money in. I imagine, I try to imagine what it would be like, finance committee, if we had this model of giving, where we all stood around and watched as everybody put money in. Okay, might be different. And finally, we have an old movie still, and there the woman is pictured as older, and they are all in biblical garb. And apparently, I didn't do the reading, but others have said that this is how the offering boxes look. They have a big horn, and people drop their money down in the horn. There you go. Steve's band collects money that way. They have a big horn with a box on the end. So many, many points of view. And we can change our slide back, Steve. Many, many points of view. And in your imagination, what perspective might you have in this story? And to be fair, you probably should try to first picture yourself in all the roles. The woman, a scribe, a disciple, or just a bystander. If you were to create an image like those artists, who would you include? How would you represent them? Now, this sermon series, and if you notice in your bulletin it says this sermon series is called Our Money Story. We're examining new ways to think about God's provision and our response as stewards of what the Creator provides. So, as with any discussion of giving, especially money, this carries layers of feelings. We have societal expectations. We have shoulds or should nots. We struggle with the notion of accepting God's gifts and then how to use those gifts and to know what's enough. So our goal in this series is to think in different ways on Bible stories about our relationship to money. I know there are people that think we talk about money too much at church, but I think 1 or 2 days a year is probably not too much. This specific passage is often preached as a simple lesson that says, hey, look, even the poor widow gave something, and Jesus praised her, so you should give too. And it's therefore often used during times like this, when we're talking about stewardship. It emphasizes personal giving of money as a response to God's goodness to us. And that's okay as far as it goes. However, I think we often miss what Jesus is really saying, what he's really talking about, which is giving everything. You should remember that this is Jesus' last public teaching. So it can also be seen as a lesson that prepares the disciples and other followers for what's coming very soon during Holy Week, when they will be asked to follow Jesus at great personal cost to the foot of the cross. The Gospel of Mark puts it this way. She has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. Really, to read this passage as just simply giving some money misses the point. But there's also more here, as one would expect with teachings of Jesus. One of the problems we have when we preach and when we read the Bible is we often read just like one little thing. Just one little paragraph or one little story. They're kind of chunked up in our Bible for us. It's the story of the widow's mite. We read that. But one thing that gets missed is when you don't read the larger picture. And that's the case here. So in the spirit of using our imaginations and taking another point of view, let's look at the first part of that passage to see the contrast that's being offered to the disciples. Jesus is saying, look, that's being offered to his disciples. Well, first we have Jesus' denunciation of the scribes. He even says, beware of them. So what is it that brings such a strong response from Jesus that he's extremely critical of the scribes in a public way? All these are men who have acted as lawyers and judges when the law is interpreted, and we have to understand that the law at the time was both religious law and the law of their society. It's combined. When it's interpreted and applied to the lives of the Israelites. The scribes, as their name implies, also carefully copied out the Jewish scriptures accurately to create new Torah scrolls. These are the people that were held in high esteem for their learning, their intellectual ability. What is it that Jesus decries? Well, if you're paying attention, you probably know some of this. But, and that's a good question, we'll come back to that. Maybe you have some other questions. Feel free to ask me. But let's hold on to that thought because we also have to understand a bit more about the status of widows in biblical society to better grasp what's going on here. Biblical scholars paint a complicated picture of the situation for widows in Jesus' day. When a woman was given in marriage, she was transferred from her father's household to the family of her husband. If her husband died, she was still over here in this family. So there were several possibilities that existed. She might be married off to a brother-in-law. You remember that back in that day, men often had more than one wife. And especially if she didn't have children and she was now part of this family, perhaps she would be married off so she could have children. That would be one thing. Another thing is that in some cases, they could be transferred back to their father's household. And finally, there were women who did have money or property, and they would be free to manage their own affairs. But many widows without male protection were economically threatened, and their position in society was very precarious. Throughout the Jewish scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, and our Christian Gospels, and the writings of the early church that are in the New Testament, there are instructions and examples to follow about how widows and others that are poor, orphans and foreigners who are living among the Israelites, were supposed to be taken care of. I know people say they like to have a biblical preacher. So let's go to the early part of the Bible and look at Leviticus, third book of the Bible, where there are laws, rituals, and instructions given by God to the Israelites to maintain a holy and pure relationship with him. In chapter 19 of Leviticus, verses 9 to 10, it says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, don't reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings." Now, gleanings are just what gets dropped on the ground. Don't gather that up. "Do not go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave those for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God." Now, in the Bible, when God says, "I am the Lord your God," he means it. You're supposed to pay attention. So, here we see God giving his people a practical way to share their resources with their neighbors, welcoming the poor and the hungry who live at the margins of society to come and take a share. And there's another example in Exodus 22, verses 21 to 22, where God offers more instruction on caring for those foreigners, orphans, and widows. "Do not treat or oppress foreigners, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. If you do, they cry out, and I will certainly hear their cry." And in that verse, God goes on to describe what happens if you do that. You can follow up and read that on your own. In Exodus, we see that God is preparing those wandering Israelites for a new life in society as they leave Egypt's slavery behind, and they're now free. God gives rules for proper living, and in this passage, he reminds them that the children of God include widows, orphans, and even the foreigners living among them. All of them are to be included in the care provided by God. And I'll also remind you that Jesus said he did not come to replace these laws, but to fulfill these laws. We sometimes want to say, "Oh, Old Testament doesn't apply to us." That is not what Jesus said, being biblically speaking. So, why does Jesus speak so strongly against the scribes? We'll come back to that question. Well, first, these are the men who are supposed to know the laws. Every time they write out a new scroll of the Torah, the scribes are responsible literally for writing down in perfect fashion, because if they made a mistake, they had to throw the whole thing away. They had to, perfect fashion, they had to write down these laws. Leviticus, Exodus, that God gave his people. If anyone should understand how widows were supposed to be treated, then it should be the scribes. And yet here in the temple, they're the ones who are living lives of luxury, showing off their fine clothes, drawing attention to themselves in the marketplace, demanding the best seats in the house, showing off with long prayers. Now, our modern phrase for this kind of leader would be they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. They know what they're supposed to be doing, but are hypocrites. In addition to being bad examples, Jesus says that they are actually responsible for many widows being poor. They devour their houses. Now, was Jesus, who was a Jew, condemning all Jews as hypocrites? No. But he certainly doesn't want his small band of disciples to emulate these so-called religious leaders in the temple. This is a dangerous enterprise because Jesus, the blameless Son of God, came to teach lessons like this where he points at a behavior and says, "Beware." But you know the old adage that applies to the rest of us who are not blameless. When you point your finger at someone, remember that there are four others pointing back at you. So I also need us to grapple with the point of view that we hold in our heart of hearts. Is there an inner scribe? What is holding us back from total commitment to God and adequately providing for all his people? There's an old bumper sticker, and actually there's an old song based on this that says, "God said it, I believe it, that settles it." You ever heard that? I could have played that little song for you. It's out there on the internet. I wonder how many people really want to apply that simple little phrase to a scene like this one, because it's a tough lesson once you really consider what is being said. So when we say we ask you to prayerfully consider something as something that like our giving, this is the sort of conversation you need to be having with God. The contrast that Jesus offers, this choice. You can choose to be a scribe who is a leader that ignores or even preys upon the poor and the vulnerable, such as the widows, orphans, and foreigners mentioned in our Bible. A leader that wants to be noticed and given adulation and praise. who goes on at length to prove how religious they are, who expects their very best and the finest. Or you can choose to be like the humble widow, quietly giving everything to God. Many, many points of view to consider from this text today as we continue the sermon series. Always choices to be made. Scripture calls us to reimagine a world where people are provided for and the economic and social systems that we all participate in benefit all. That's what Leviticus and Exodus were talking about. I encourage you to use your imaginations and have those conversations with God this week as we continue to consider our money story. I'll close with a quote for you taken from a favorite biblical scholar, A.J. Levine. She's Jewish. She knows her Jewish scriptures, but she also teaches or has taught at Vanderbilt, taught about the Gospels. So she does a Jewish perspective, speaking of points of view, on Jesus. And this is what she wrote. We know that Jesus will be giving his whole life. The widow, like Jesus, gives everything she has. She has 2 coins. She could have held one back. She doesn't. Jesus could have resisted the suffering. He doesn't. He could have resisted dying. He made his decision to go to the cross.
Thank you for listening to By the Well podcast from Wall Street United Methodist Church. We invite you to connect with us on our website, wallstreetumc.org, and remember to like and share wherever you listen. Thank you for being a part of our community.